Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching the history of Baghdad, the medieval world's greatest city by Cogito. I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce the channel name, please let me know down below. So this video was recommended a while ago, we're finally getting to it. Apologies for that, I have many reactions on the back burner and sometimes it takes me quite a while to get to them. So, I believe this video will be more of a learning reaction. I don't know too much about Baghdad. Now, we have touched on it a couple of times, particularly in our Islamic history reactions. I know that Baghdad was a really important city in the Islamic world, and that it was a center of learning and education. That's probably one of the more famous facts about medieval Baghdad, or at least Baghdad in this time period. But I'm excited to learn a lot more about what this video calls the medieval world's greatest city. So, if you guys end up enjoying this video, I'd appreciate it if you would check out the Patreon and channel memberships, both of which you can find down below, and both of which will give you access to exclusive reactions. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
This is Baghdad, home to 7 million people. This
Modern Baghdad.
Sprawling urban jungle is the second largest city in the Arab world after Cairo. But between the skyscrapers and honking cars, you can see the remains of this city's magnificent medieval past. This once round city's walls crumbled long ago, but it was here 1,000 years ago that brilliant scientists, architects, writers and merchants of different races and religions made massive contributions to the knowledge of humanity.
Oh, I'm excited to get into this one, and I've never seen a video from this channel before, but I'm already getting a sense of the art style. You know, relatively simple, but because of that simplicity, they're able to fit a lot of detail into the frame. So I'm excited to get into this.
Back when Paris and London were home to just 20,000 people, over 1 million Baghdadis lived here.
I think this is sort of now a more commonly known fact about Europe. You know, speaking as someone who grew up in the United Kingdom and then the United States, went through the Western education system, grew up with Western culture, you know, we very much think of the Western world sort of on the top, or at least that's how we were educated. And that's because, as we went into the modern era, Europe basically conquered the world, and then one of those European colonies, which became the United States, became, you know, the global superpower of the 1900s in competition with the USSR, and then became the only global superpower, though that is changing. But you know, it was not always this way. Europe was not always on the top. In fact, for most of history, Europe was more on the bottom. It was very poor, impoverished, compared to a lot of other places around the world during, say, the medieval ages. Europe was going through feudalism, most people were peasants, it was a pretty poor place, and then you can compare it to the Middle East of that era, you know, the Islamic Golden Age, India, China, Native American empires. You know, there were a lot of other empires and regions throughout the world that were far richer and more prosperous. Though, like I said, I think this is becoming a more well-known fact in the Western world, as some of that Western chauvinism hopefully goes away over time.
Among canals, libraries and palm trees. So what is the history of Baghdad? What's a house of wisdom? And what does it have to do with medieval...
The Baghdad House of Wisdom. I'm very excited to learn about that because it's something that of course I've heard, but I really don't know anything about it.
Robots trying to get everyone drunk. Well, let's find out. So, it's 632 CE and the Prophet Muhammad has just died. And he left behind a religion called Islam that was adopted by his people, the Arabs.
Yes, he did. And you can see already how, under the Prophet Muhammad, Islam had spread throughout Arabia. Following his death, it will spread much, much further.
Do you know what I was thinking? Do you know what we should do? Conquer everything. Oh, our God. I was thinking the same thing. And, well, they did. This
Yep.
is 11,100,000 square kilometers of land.
My goodness, just look at the size of this land empire. And we saw how the caliphate expanded in our early Muslim expansion series. That was a good one. We saw how it began with Muhammad in Arabia and then rapidly expanded in, as you can see, basically every direction, stretching from, Iran, stretching from the edge of the Indian subcontinent all the way to Spain. Incredibly impressive.
Spanning 3 continents. It's been like 90 years since Muhammad died. How do you do this? Ancient Red Bull? Is it just me? Or was that easier than you thought it was going to be? Yeah. This expansion happened under the Rashidun and then the Umayyad caliphates.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely goes a lot quicker than I think anybody would have expected. And in terms of why that happened, I think there are a lot of reasons. I think one of the main reasons is that, if we go back to the pre-Islamic map of the Middle East, we can see it's dominated by 2 great empires, the Sassanids and the Romans. And by the time Islam had began to emerge, the Romans and the Sassanids, through a combination of many different factors, but the main factor being that they wouldn't stop fighting each other, had seriously weakened their power as empires. I mean, they had basically beaten each other into submission many times over. There were times where it really looked like the Sassanids were going to completely destroy the Roman Empire, but the Roman Empire would come back and do serious damage to the Sassanids. So when Islam came along, the Roman Empire, which had already declined from the collapse of the West, and the Sassanids were seriously weakened from fighting each other and could not stand up against Muslim expansion. Now, as you can see, the Romans eventually managed to halt it, but not before the caliphate had seized a massive amount of Roman territory, and it seized a lot of former Roman territory. We can look at Spain, we can look at North Africa. That used to be Roman territory, but Rome had already lost it to a variety of European tribes, so it was kind of easy picking for the caliphate. And as we mentioned, the Sassanid Empire was also weakened from its fighting with Rome, and it didn't manage to stop the caliphate at all. It completely crumbled to Muslim expansion. So, like I said, there are a lot of reasons I think that the caliphate managed to expand so quickly. I think the weakness of Rome and Persia is one of the more influential reasons.
Their rulers were caliphs, or successors, and the Umayyad Caliphate was based here in Damascus, Syria. But the Umayyads had some internal issues. Their caliphate excluded non-Arabs from positions of power, even if they were Muslim. Millions of Christians, Jews, and non-Arab Muslims like Iranians, Egyptians, and Berbers living in the massive empire's recently conquered lands were not huge fans of this policy.
Yep.
Spotting this,
as you can imagine, and once again we saw this in our early Muslim expansion series, to a lot of non-Arab Muslims, this seemed incredibly hypocritical. I mean, we're all supposed to be Muslims under Allah, and yet you treat us differently because we're not Arab. Where's the logic in that? And so I think rightfully so, a lot of non-Arab peoples were very upset about this.
Weakness. Abu al-Abbas, with huge support from Iranians, destroyed the Umayyad armies, wiped out the dynasty, and founded the Abbasid Caliphate in its place in 750 CE. The new Abbasid Caliphate needed a capital away from Arabia and Syria and closer to where its power base was, Iran. The second Abbasid Caliph, al-Mansur, located a strategic spot in Mesopotamia that already had a small market town called Suk Baghdad.
Interesting. It seems like it was near Ctesiphon, which was the capital of the Sassanid Empire. It was the great city of this region, but now that's sort of shifting to Baghdad. And once again, you can see, and when I say once again, I talked about this before, we can see how important Iran was to the caliphate. Of course, Iran was sort of absorbed into the Muslim world. Before the spread of Islam, Iran was primarily Zoroastrian, but, it became very Muslim. But its cultural influence on the Islamic world was massive, and we're sort of seeing that here.
This town was ancient. It was even mentioned in documents from King Hammurabi's time, around 1750 BCE. Geographically, it was perfect, right in the middle of the trade routes between the Persian Gulf, Armenia, Egypt, Syria, China, and the Byzantine Empire.
Yep, and we saw, by the way, in our series on Khosrow, one of the great shahs of Iran / Persia. I use them interchangeably, so I might use Persia or Iran, by the way. But we saw how Khosrow had built more infrastructure, more roads that really extended the Silk Road further west. It already existed, he just strengthened it. And so as we can see on this map, a lot of those goods that came from the east, India, China, would have to pass through this central area, greater Iran, in this case Baghdad, to get to the west. Whether that be, getting to the Roman Empire, then to the rest of Europe, or across North Africa to Alexandria. It passed through Iran.
Plus, it was right between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Founded in 762 CE, the city went by a few names, like Mandinat al-Salam, the city of peace. But it seems like the old market town's name, Baghdad, stuck. Al-Mansur had the city built in a perfect circle, around 2.7 kilometers in diameter.
So it seems like he chose a rather small market town and then basically constructed this city almost from scratch.
Protected by 3 concentric brick walls and a fancy moat. The city had 4 massive gates from which came 4 roads. Each gate was named for the city it faced: Damascus, Basra, Kufa, and Khorasan.
Wow. Look at that. I mean, first off, I love the animation and the art that they're using, but look at the scale. This is the sort of city building, infrastructure building that you think of when you think of Rome at the height of the Roman Empire. At this point, Rome could not do this kind of stuff anymore. They could not marshal the resources and wealth to build cities like this, but the recently expanded caliphate could. This is an empire at or reaching the height of its power, building these very impressive cities, monuments, roads. Very impressive.
These connected Baghdad to the world, but made it clear that this city was the symbolic center of a new world. Behind each gate were 3 arcades lined with markets acting like the arteries of the city. Between these main streets were the residential neighborhoods. At the core of the city was a huge open green space. There you could find the Caliph's Palace of the Golden Gate, topped with a giant green dome, with the central mosque by its side. The city was surrounded by a network of canals, creating fertile land for agriculture. The city had thousands of fountains and public baths open to everyone. People would walk near the streams, spread out on the grass, and collect fruit and flowers from the stunning gardens across the city.
Yeah, incredible. And, this is titled The Medieval World's Greatest City. You can sort of start to see why. As someone who's far more familiar with Western history, Roman history, these are the sort of cities, this level of infrastructure that was built, like I said, during the height of the Roman Empire. But the West has fallen. The Byzantine Empire is, it'll last for a long time, but it is a shell of what Rome once was. This sort of construction really doesn't happen that often in the medieval Western world. From the fall of Rome, everything is sort of shrunk down, scaled back a little bit. There's less infrastructure building. There are a lot of building of massive, beautiful cathedrals, but when we're talking about these massive cities that everybody can use with public baths, some of that stuff was still built. I'm not denying that, but maybe not to this impressive scale. It takes a lot of resources to marshal this sort of project. And I'm not trying to dunk on Dark Age Europe too much. I know there's a big debate about how bad were the Dark Ages, and people, like they showed in this video, imagine, unwashed, dirty peasants. That's not exactly true. People would wash. There were baths that people could use, all of that kind of stuff. So don't get the wrong impression. I'm not trying to mischaracterize anything. But, this is an incredibly impressive infrastructure project that takes a powerful government or powerful empire to achieve.
In its large parks, you could see horse racing and polo, or, if you wanted to, you could visit the zoo, displaying lions, elephants, giraffes, and all sorts of wild animals. On the canals, dotted with palm trees, you could see thousands of gondolas dancing like sunbeams on the water, carrying the inhabitants of the city from one part of Baghdad to the other. And according to legend, the city had no mosquitoes, which is very important because 1, mosquitoes are pure evil, and 2, malaria, not fun.
Yeah.
While a round city looks cool, it only lasted for about 70 years. You see, his palace in the centre was supposed to protect the caliph because there were hundreds of thousands of peasants between the caliph and whoever wanted to kill him. It was like a great wall of peasants.
Yes, but, and if you're some sort of king, a caliph, an emperor, sure, it's good to have hundreds of thousands of peasants between you and your enemies, if those peasants are willing to defend you. But what if your peasants get angry at you? What if you're an unpopular leader? Then you can sort of reframe the situation to say that you're trapped in the middle of hundreds of thousands of angry peasants. At least that's sort of where my mind goes.
Which is a great idea until you realise that also meant once enemy troops took over the city, there was no way for the caliph to escape.
That too. You've trapped yourself in many ways. You have made yourself incredibly secure, but whether it's angry peasants, some sort of revolt or uprising, or if your enemies actually manage to surround you, then you've sort of trapped yourself.
Great Wall of Peasants is kind of sneaky that way. The increasingly busy and chaotic markets inside the walls seemed like a security risk, so the Caliph al-Mansur moved them outside the walls where suburbs were already growing rapidly. The round city was swallowed up by the thriving suburbs and soon vanished.
And really, when you see, first off, impressive transition, when you see a medieval city like this with these massive scale suburbs, it must be a metropolis. Now, I know these days every city has suburbs, but remember, you cannot travel that far, that fast at this point. You could ride in a cart or on a horse, but for the vast majority of people living in this city, they're going to be traveling everywhere on foot or maybe on boats sometimes. So keep that in mind. If you have these massive sprawl of suburbs, it must mean you have a truly massive, self-sufficient powerhouse of a city. We talked about most cities in Europe at this time, London, Paris, etc., etc. Most of them are at a much, much smaller scale than a city like this, a much smaller scale than they would later reach in the modern age. So that's something to think about.
Now the whole area was Baghdad. The bricks of the round city's walls were used to build this new growing Baghdad, and it became this cosmopolitan trading hub linking the east and the west. Their ships traded as far as the Baltic to Madagascar to China. Furs from Russia, African gold, Indonesian spices, Indian steel, silks from China, you could find all of it in Baghdad. They traded so widely that this bronze cross with an Arabic inscription that says Bismillah, which means in the name of God, was discovered in a bog in Ireland.
Wow, that's incredible. And also this network, this trade network, which also serves to transport ideas, culture, lots of different things. Whenever you have a trade network, that's a multi-purpose network. Trade networks never just send goods from one place to another. They're known to send many other things. And there's, if we look throughout this era of history, there's always that sort of center. At this point, it's Baghdad. in the future, I think about, say, the Ottoman Empire, Constantinople, or later Istanbul, will be the center that they strive to take from the Byzantines, and they eventually do. Of course, it will become less important because of the Age of Exploration. But it's really fascinating to have a city, whether it be Constantinople, Alexandria, Baghdad, which have all been incredibly important cities in this region at different times, sometimes at the same time, but seeing these really important cities sort of at the center of this system. Because oftentimes when we look at maps, particularly older maps, at least in the West, sort of Europe will be framed as the center of everything. But if we're thinking about Europe, Asia, and Africa, which are, this one big mass, then in reality, the center is somewhere around Iran, basically, I would think. Maybe not geographically, but this is where everything passes through, from east to west. So it's just a really interesting perspective. It's really fascinating to see.
Which is a fair bit away from Baghdad. Between the years 900 and 1000 of the Common Era, the city reached 1 million inhabitants, making it the world's largest city, truly the metropolis of its time. And Baghdad peaked under the rule of its most famous caliph, Harun al-Rashid. Harun was the son of the third caliph, al-Mahdi, by one of his wives, al-Hazuran, who is a fascinating woman, by the way. Al-Hazuran was a slave given to al-Mahdi by his father.
Wow.
At the time, many of the concubines of nobles were well educated. Some learned writing, poetry, music, dance, history, philosophy, and science. Al-Mahdi fell madly in love with Hazuran. She convinced him not only to free her from slavery, but also to make her his official wife.
Wow. It's a pretty remarkable story, though I don't think it's as rare as might be expected. Now, I do not know too much about royal consorts or harems or anything like that, but what little I do know, is mostly in regards to the Ottoman Empire, is that these consorts or these women who were in these harems were often highly educated, were often very capable, and were often slaves, right? So these things were, I think, often true, and they could really rise up through the ranks, reach a level of power that was incredibly impressive, as we're seeing here.
She used this to build considerable power. She sat with her husband at court, which was unusual at the time, and met with his ministers behind the scenes.
Wow.
She discussed state business with generals and foreign diplomats and managed the empire's administration. She made sure her sons, Musa al-Hadi and Harun al-Rashid, were placed ahead of the caliph's other sons as heirs to the empire. She used her wealth to fund canal building in Baghdad, and it is said that a quarter of the city was named after her.
Wow.
She built well.
And this is something we often see from powerful women who reach this point. Clearly she exerted a lot of direct influence, but in many ways it's still a man's world. She is still limited in some ways. And so you can see her moving her sons to the front of the pack. She's trying to exert influence through her sons. This is a very common thing seen throughout the ancient and medieval world, whether we're talking about consorts, queens, any sort of powerful women. They would often exert influence both directly and indirectly. And one of the more sort of indirect ways was to exert influence through your male family members, often your sons.
And shade-giving trees along pilgrimage routes to Mecca, and on one of her own pilgrimages, she bought the house in which the Prophet Muhammad was born and turned it into a mosque. You can still go see it today, but it's a library now. Al-Mahdi died suddenly in 785 CE, which threw the empire into chaos. But Hazuran took control of the situation and secured a smooth transition of power to her older son, Musa al-Hadi. She stopped a military rebellion and had all of the military officers and court officials swear allegiance to her son, who wasn't even in Baghdad yet. And how does al-Hadi repay his mother? He gets jealous of her power tries to push her out of political life.
I mean, well, once again, this is not too surprising. I think we can find a lot of examples throughout history of this sort of relationship. She sort of plays the queen mother role, and, as I said, exerts influence through her son. He is technically in the position of power, in this case, the caliph, or in other examples, the king, the emperor, but she's the one pulling the strings, and so he gets jealous and tries to push her out. Another sort of common historical trope. I don't know how this one's going to end up, though.
Publicly humiliates her several times, and some sources say he even tried to have his own mother poisoned. After a year of ruling, at 24 years old, al-Hadi died of poisoning.
Yeah.
So be nice to your mother.
Yeah.
The new caliph.
Be nice to your mother. That's always a good rule. But especially if she's the one who got you your position. Hey, be careful, I'll say that much.
Harun al-Rashid adored his mother. When Hazuran died in November of 789, Harun helped carry her body barefoot through the mud on a rainy day as a sign of respect for the woman behind the reign of 3 caliphs. During his reign, Harun fought off invasions and rebellions to maintain his empire that spanned from India to North Africa. He forced the Byzantine Empire to pay him tribute, and during his reign, wealth poured into Baghdad.
Yeah, the Byzantine Empire would pay a lot of tribute throughout its time existing. If we go back to the old unified Roman Empire, when it was at the top of the world, it wouldn't pay tribute to anyone. That's not true. It did pay off some people, but, you couldn't imagine it paying tribute in some sort of submissive way, recognizing its role on the bottom. But that is exactly what's happening. As you can see, the Byzantine Empire is not in a good spot. It is surrounded by enemies. You've got the caliphate is the most powerful, but you've also got the Bulgars to the west. They are causing and will continue to cause a lot of trouble for the Byzantines. And so they solve a lot of their problems by just paying people off, or in this case, paying tribute. And though, the Romans may not recognize it, they were a very proud people. The caliphate has absolutely eclipsed them in terms of power at this point. I mean, it's taken much of their former territory and the former territory of their rival, the Persians, the Sassanids. Though, once again, there's a lot of Persian influence within the caliphate.
He was helped by the fact that the Abbasid military made a lot of improvements on the battlefield. From little things like adopting the stirrups in cavalry, which attached the rider to the horse, to the use of naphtha, a refined version of petroleum used in fire-based warfare.
Whoa.
They developed these fire grenades called naphtha shells to throw at the enemy, and a section of the Abbasid army were called naphtha firemen, archers that specialised in flaming arrows, who, very wisely, wore fireproof suits that let them rush into the cities and castles that they had just set on fire. They also had a camel-based ambulance corps. This line is just in here because I liked it. They're camels. They're the llamas of the desert.
True. Yeah, grenades are often the first thing to come when we're talking about military technology. I mean, people think that grenades are a relatively modern invention, but that's not true. I mean, if you think about, I don't know if they used gunpowder. I don't know when gunpowder was invented, to be honest with you. But if you think about gunpowder, sort of one of the easier things to do with it is pack it into a shell and then toss it, set it on fire, or something like that. And so I know that relatively early, if we're talking about, say, like early modern Europe, still a while after this, but, you have men still wearing armor, knights, I suppose, using an early form of grenades, which is pretty remarkable, interesting to think about.
The Abbasids oversaw a global network of merchants, spies, and diplomats stretching from France to China. Harun al-Rashid once sent gifts to the Holy Roman Emperor Charlemagne. These gifts included silks, spices, books, and Abul Abbas, who was an elephant.
Wow.
Getting the elephant to France was probably pretty difficult, but once it arrived, Charlemagne was obsessed. Legend says he took Abul Abbas to battlefields and
wow.
travels, and when Charlemagne died, his remains were wrapped in a silk with an elephant print.
Oh, he really loved his elephant. That's pretty precious. I just love the cartoons in the background, how they're showing this. That's a funny interpretation of Charlemagne with his new little, aka massive pet,
which is just adorable. Harun and Charlemagne sent each other a lot of gifts and bonded over their shared hatred of the Byzantine Empire. Harun actually wrote a fairly sassy letter to the Byzantine emperor that I love. It says, "The least of the territories ruled by the least of my subjects provides a revenue larger than your whole dominion." Harun...
Yeah, as you can see, Byzantines, enemies on all sides, they're not in a great position at this point. Now, the Byzantines are the true inheritors of the Roman legacy. You know, the Byzantine Empire is the continuation of the Roman Empire. But at this point, you know, it's fading. It is losing more and more territory over time. And though it will manage to survive for a long time after this, it is not what it once was. And so you have the caliphate emerging in the east, which is probably the greatest empire of this time. I suspect maybe there are others, I'm not sure. And then in the west, you have the Holy Roman Empire. Charlemagne is the best representation of that, who also lays claim to the Roman legacy. Now, his claim is way more shaky and illegitimate, but, you know, he has enough power in the region to make himself a rather impressive figure and sort of attempt to challenge Byzantine legitimacy.
Harun was a great patron of the arts. Under his rule, Baghdad was full of artists, scholars, and poets from 3 continents. This is how Harun al-Rashid ended up in one of the greatest pieces of literature of all time, Alf Layla wa Layla, or The 1001 Nights, or Arabian Nights.
Okay, I was going to say, I do not recognize that name, but then we got to 1001 Nights, very famous piece of literature.
The 1001 Nights is a collection of folk stories. The story of its origins say that an Iranian king called Shahryar marries a woman and then she cheats on him. And so, he murders her. He marries many more times, but he has trust issues now, and so he kills every single one of his new brides. Side note, therapy did not exist yet. He then marries a woman called Scheherazade. On the first night after their marriage, she tells him a story that ends in a cliffhanger that she will only finish the next day.
This is a very famous story.
She does this for 1,000 nights and a night. The stories interest King Shahryar so much that he doesn't kill her. And they also make him wiser, less murdery, and make him fall deeply in love with Scheherazade.
Wow.
And they live happily ever after. She was fine with all of the previous murder, apparently. Because Scheherazade told so many tales, it was easy for anyone to add or subtract stories to the collection. Aladdin, Sinbad the Sailor, and Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves are all tales from this book that were added at a later point.
Oh, it's fascinating. But that makes a lot of sense. You have this collection of stories. Of course, it's going to be added to and subtracted from over time. Of course, this is a collection of stories that's very famous, even in the Western world, and some of these stories are extremely famous. I mean, Aladdin, mainly due to the Disney adaptation, but it has its roots in this, so that's pretty remarkable.
Some of the major protagonists of 1001 Nights are Harun al-Rashid and his vizier, Jafar. This is the Jafar that inspired the Disney villain. The real Jafar actually came from a powerful family called the Barmakids, who were originally Buddhist from Afghanistan. Jafar convinced Harun to open the first paper-making houses in Baghdad, as the Arabs had just learned how to make paper from the Chinese.
And I've said this before, but if you have a, world-defining, extremely important invention, and you're not quite sure where it comes from, China's a pretty good bet. And if it's not China, then India's a pretty good bet. I mean, the amount of inventions that are known worldwide and have been incredibly important to human development that come from India and China is quite remarkable.
And paper was much more efficient as it was cheaper and easier to make than parchment made from animal skin. And don't even get me started on papyrus. Paper, combined with Baghdad's many different people, cultures and languages, created an intellectual revolution. Arabic was the language of the empire, but scholars in Baghdad became experts in translation. In
Yep.
Baghdad, you could find people reading the words of Aristotle or the Buddha, all the way to the Hindu Vedas and Zoroaster.
Yeah, and we've seen this before in our videos on the Islamic Golden Age. A lot of these works from around the world, whether we're talking about Greek philosophy, Buddhism, of course, Islamic philosophy, Zoroastrianism, which was the religion of Iran before Islam, all of these different works from all of these different places were collected by these Islamic scholars, translated into Arabic, and then preserved. And a lot of these works, which we have today, that have been translated back into their native languages, were only preserved because they were preserved by the Islamic scholars and retranslated out of Arabic back into those original languages. So they really did quite a service for learning and education on a global scale.
Jews, Manichaeans, Christians, Zoroastrians, Buddhists, and Hindus met and exchanged ideas. One result of this exchange was Arabic numerals, the ones that we use today, including the revolutionary number 0. These originated in India, were improved on by scholars in Baghdad.
Yeah, once again, we saw this in our Islamic Golden Age video. Sort of originated in India. There's that statement about if you don't know where something's invented, China or India. Originated in India, then came to the Muslim worlds where they tweaked a little bit, and then sent out to, well, the rest of the world, but in particular Europe, right?
And then spread from the Middle East to Europe.
Yeah.
Baghdad was a crossroads of knowledge filled with schools and libraries, the most important of which was the House of Wisdom. We don't know much about it, but it looks like this was a combined library, academy, and research institute that welcomed scholars from around the world to translate, preserve, and debate their works.
Interesting. Okay, so there's a bit of mystery associated with it. It seems to be one of the great houses of learning throughout history. I mean, we have stuff like the Library of Alexandria, seems an equivalent collection of knowledge and an institution for learning as well.
Under Harun's son, the Caliph al-Mamun, the House of Wisdom became the world's largest library and the most important storage site of knowledge since the Library of Alexandria.
There you
books
go.
in Arabic, Greek, Latin, Persian, Syriac, Chinese, and Sanskrit. Many ancient Greek texts only survived due to Arabic translations of them, which made their way into Europe during the Renaissance.
Yep, and this is exactly what I just said. And this is the point that I made during the Islamic Golden Age videos. You know, some pagan philosophy was still influential in Europe throughout the Middle Ages, right? Not to deny that, but Christianity had become far more important. I mean, Christianity was really the frame through which Europe saw the world. And so a lot of these old pagan texts, this old Greek philosophy, was forgotten about, lost, you know. I mean, there had been a lot of conflict in those lands, and was only preserved by the Muslim world. And so when the Renaissance occurs, and there is this revitalized interest in old Greek, Roman, classical texts, a lot of these texts are accessed from the Islamic world. They're retranslated into Latin and then a bunch of different European languages, and they can now spread throughout Europe again. So it's a real remarkable preservation of knowledge.
Greek philosophy influenced the Middle East so heavily that the Arabic word for philosophy is just falsafa, which is just philosophy said differently. Here you can see an Arabic painting of Socrates, or in Arabic, Sokrat, teaching his students. Caliph al-Mamun paid scholars to travel abroad and bring back books. Once those books got to Baghdad, they were copied, translated, and sent to other scholars across the empire.
Wow.
After wars, Mamun would actually demand books when negotiating peace treaties. He became so obsessed with collecting genius, he apparently offered the Byzantine emperor £2,000 of gold for a mathematician called Leo living in Constantinople. They refused the offer. If Leo
clearly they know the worth of knowledge.
had moved to Baghdad, though, he would have had quite the life. One scholar, the Nestorian Christian Hunyan ibn Ashak, lived in a mansion and received a massage and a manicure daily. One scholar said about Baghdad,
That is quite a luxurious way of living.
Nowhere in the world have I seen better financial arrangements to assist a scholar. This
I think we should bring some of this back today. I think we need more support for scholars in our society.
thirst for knowledge sparked the Islamic Golden Age.
Yes.
Just a quick note about this name. It's called the Islamic Golden Age, but many Zoroastrians, Christians and Jews contributed. The Golden Age included people from Central Asia to Iberia. It was so successful because the caliphs built a multicultural empire of...
Yeah, I mean, they're making exactly the points that I would make. It's called the Islamic Golden Age, but it is a golden age because it was so diverse and multicultural. They were drawing knowledge from around the world, but it was able to be brought together under the unifying identity and religion of Islam and the unifying language of Arabic. It's very important, particularly if you're an empire of this size, to have things that bring you together, right? Regardless of your cultural or ethnic backgrounds, if you have things that bring you together like language, Arabic, or like religion and identity, Islam, then it makes a lot easier for you to be a multicultural empire, but to, survive for longer. And this is why I think this era of education was so successful because, Arabic was a way to bring everybody together. Everybody could communicate, but they also had access to a lot of different cultures, a lot of different literature from around the world, which they would then translate into Arabic. So I think it's a really fascinating process.
Obsessed with learning.
I mean, we see something similar in the Western world with, Latin. Now, of course, at this point, the Western world is not at all unified. Certainly not like the caliphate is. There are a bunch of different kingdoms constantly warring with each other. But if we look at sort of the institutions that go above governments, which is mainly the church and religion, that was also something that brought Europeans together, sometimes. And the language of the church, Latin, was a way that Europeans could communicate regardless of what their native language was. So we do see a sort of similar phenomenon, but not on such a wide scale, and certainly not the unity that the caliphate would show at times. It was also very divided at times.
Some scholars have actually suggested using the name Arabic Golden Age because the main language was Arabic, but it's still being debated. The House of Wisdom brought together different scientific traditions from around the world, and they saw the differences between Iranian, Indian and Greek texts, which meant they couldn't all be right. So these scholars didn't just copy and translate books, they tested them, they commented on them, and they developed new ideas around them.
Yep, we have a real scientific golden age here. Many people talk about the emergence of the scientific method, the scientific revolution, which would come much later in Europe, but many parts of that scientific revolution, scientific method, were already in use many places throughout the world, and this is a good example of that.
Like algebra, invented by al-Khwarizmi. He combined Indian and Greek mathematical ideas and made something new, mathematics without numbers, like when you calculate with x and y. This completely revolutionized science and made me fail maths class. It's only thanks to Khwarizmi that we can use algorithms, for example. The word algorithm is just a mangled Latinized version of al-Khwarizmi's name, from al-Khwarizmi to algorithmus to algorithm. Baghdad led the world in cartography and astronomy. Scholars in Baghdad upgraded the astrolabe, a device that measures the incline of an object and can help navigate over sea and...
Yeah, you don't want to look at European map making and navigation at this point. They'll get it a lot later. But, I think the Islamic world has got it a lot better in the medieval ages.
Land. An experiment funded by Caliph Mamun, which included an astronomer called al-Farghani, calculated the circumference of the Earth to be about 38,000 kilometers, which is about 4% off the real number.
Not bad.
Some Italian guy called Christopher Columbus actually used al-Farghani's calculations for a voyage that he was planning, but he converted the Arabic miles incorrectly and thought the Earth was about half the size it actually was. He got very lucky that he crashed into a continent.
Look, if we look at the European age of exploration, beginning in the 1400s, a lot of the navigation, cartography, knowledge that the Europeans were using were taken from the Islamic world and the ancient world, ancient Greece, ancient Rome. So a lot of that stuff lasted for a really, really long time before there was, at least in Europe, any significant change to these scientific ideas. But of course, as we're seeing in the Islamic world, they were doing a lot of work on this stuff.
Caliph Mamun funded the construction of the world's first scientific observatory in Baghdad, and scholars there became experts in the stars. That's why there are so many stars with Arabic names. The Big Dipper's 7 stars all have Arabic names. Over time, some star names have been Latinized, but most of these stars got their names more than 1,000 years ago.
Wow.
Alchemy, alkali, alcohol, algebra, algorithm are all Arabic names. They also developed distillation, a way of separating liquids through differences in their boiling points. This meant that they could make some really strong alcohol, which wasn't banned in Islam yet, but actually the main application of distillation was to produce scents. Distilled rose water, for example, was used as perfume, especially beard perfume, but was also added to cosmetics, foods, and drinks. They also popularized hard soap and had massive soap factories. As a person has to get on packed trains regularly, I am extremely grateful for this.
Yeah.
Is that rose water? They perfected the distillation of crude oil into kerosene for lamps, a process without which we wouldn't have gasoline, asphalt, or plastic.
Yeah, no one knew how important that one was going to be down the line.
We have reports from the early 13th century of Muslims paving their streets with asphalt, something that wouldn't be seen anywhere else till Paris paved their streets with asphalt in 1838.
Once again, we're seeing a lot of these things, which these inventions, these ideas emerged far before I think many people realize, but would only be used on a mass scale during the modern era. The Industrial Revolution, of course, had a lot to do with this. A lot of this stuff that they're currently discovering and producing in small quantities in the Islamic world, it takes a lot of energy and resources to produce on a much larger scale, which would only come, like I said, after industrialization. Or during industrialization, of course.
In 805 CE, the first general hospital opened in Baghdad. Soon there were 30 more throughout the empire. Some developments included separating wards by disease, having in-hospital pharmacies, and keeping patient medical records. They even had psychiatric wards. This was revolutionary in a time when the mentally ill were thought to be possessed by demons in many parts of the world. These were the first modern hospitals where doctors followed the code of obligation towards their patients, regardless of their wealth, religion, or background. All doctors had to pass examinations in order to practice. These were the first medical diplomas. They also invented...
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not a historian of science or medicine, and, I don't like to generalize, but it's kind of difficult not to with a video like this. We're talking very generally. If we look at, say, European medicine, it was pretty basic, pretty inaccurate, I would say, up until rather recently. There have been a lot of massive medical breakthroughs in the Western world since, the 1700s, a lot in the 1800s. But during that time, and particularly before that time, there was, first off, a lot of mixture between religion and medicine, particularly with mental health, and a lot of ideas that were just patently incorrect. Of course, that was true worldwide, and also true to some extent in the Islamic world, but we can really see some pretty important developments in medicine, science, and technology here.
Peer-reviewed studies, clinical trials, and testing medicine on animals before humans. These doctors invented hundreds of surgical instruments and new techniques. For example, cataracts is a condition that clouds the lenses of the eye, and it ruined many lives in the ancient world. but we have descriptions from the 10th century Islamic world of a procedure that involves sucking the cataracts out of the eye through a syringe. A procedure similar to what modern medicine used up until laser surgery took over in the late 20th century. They also had these devices that boring historians called automata. But I'm no historian. Their rules don't bind me. These are robots.
Well,
super cool
yeah.
medieval robots. Some of these automated
I mean, that's kind of what automata means in a certain way.
machines are described in an amazingly titled book called The Book of Knowledge of Ingenious Mechanical Devices. Some devices described are an automatic water and soap dispenser, a giant elephant clock, a boat with a full robot band, and a programmable flute that plays itself, which seems to be humanity's first programmable machine.
Look, I think people would be surprised at the complex machines developed in the ancient world, the Islamic world, but also there were a variety of complex machines developed in ancient Rome. And that, of course, leads to the question, well, why did none of this ever become wide scale, right? You think with some of these machines, they seem to be getting sort of close to industrialization. But they just didn't have the resources or the will or whatever, or the manpower to make a lot of these machines large scale or function large scale. And so a lot of this stuff would only be used on a very small scale or very particularly or only certain people up until like the last 200 years when a lot of this technology was either repurposed or rediscovered and used on a massive industrial scale.
They also describe a very elaborate way of playing spin the bottle. This multi-storied robot was a whole party in itself. It was placed in the middle of a room. The first floor had a girl pouring wine. The second floor provided the music with 4 women playing instruments. The third floor was the entertainment, a male dancer, and at the top was a horseman carrying a lance.
Wow.
He would spin round, and every 20 minutes the horseman would stop. The lucky person that ended up in front of the lance would drink the whole liter of wine that the first robot girl was pouring. This just sounds like a really fun party to me. This golden age thrived for a couple of centuries. But in 1258 CE, the Mongol leader Hulagu, grandson of Genghis Khan.
The Mongols, as always, with their incredible influence on, everywhere, basically. Asia, Europe, the Middle East. I don't know how big the Mongol influence was on Africa, but I imagine there were some knock-on effects. I mean, if you're that influential in the rest of this one giant mass, and I'm sure Africa felt some effects from the Mongols too. Just incredibly important.
Conquered the city. They burned it down, destroyed the House of Wisdom, massacred the population, and killed the caliph.
Wow,
Legends say
really?
The Tigris River ran red with the blood of the city's citizens.
Jesus.
And then, afterwards, it ran black with the ink of its libraries. The fall of Baghdad to the Mongols ended the Abbasid Caliphate, but Baghdad as a city still attracted scholars well into the 15 and 1600s. It never completely vanished, and so the city standing today has been occupied since at least the times of Hammurabi. Today, little of what the Abbasids built remains. One of the few survivors is the Great Mosque of Samarra, which gives us a glimpse of what they were capable of. Baghdad and most of Iraq would go on to be conquered by the Ottomans and then colonized by the British Empire. The city was chosen to be the capital of the Republic of Iraq in 1958. Terrorism and a decade-long occupation by the United States military have destroyed much of the city. But today, in a recovering Baghdad, you can still walk down Mutanabi Street, a 1,000-year-old street dedicated to booksellers and readers, and take part in Baghdad's ancient obsession with sharing knowledge.
That's great.
Sharing knowledge is so important that Cogito and a bunch of our creator friends got together and made
Cogito, I did pronounce it right. So you can check out their video linked in the description. Check out Nebula, Curiosity Stream, all that good stuff. Baghdad has never reached that level again, unfortunately. It's had a lot of trials and tribulations recently, but I imagine throughout its existence. But yeah, it was a truly impressive city. This is a very interesting video to watch. The medieval world's greatest city. I don't like to talk in absolutes, but it certainly seems like it was an incredible, impressive collection of science, education, learning, medicine, all that good stuff. Truly fascinating. And of course, under the Ottomans, the Ottomans would conquer most of the Middle East, if not all of the Middle East, at one point. The Ottoman Empire, another one that got massive and then started to retract. But they would be the masters of the Middle East, the masters of the Islamic world at one point. But under them, their center of power was certainly shifted westwards, right? They were very much focused on Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, and then when they captured Constantinople, that was their center of power. Constantinople, later Istanbul, and so, Baghdad didn't really rise again under the Ottomans because they had shifted westwards compared to other Islamic empires and caliphates throughout time. But yeah, this was a really interesting video. I learned quite a lot. I hope you guys did too. If you enjoyed this one, I'd appreciate it if you would leave a like, subscribe, check out the Patreon and channel memberships, through which you can get exclusive reaction content. Anyway, I hope you guys are having a good day today, and I will see you again next time. Goodbye.